Hey there, ready to unlock some brain power? Today's deep dive takes us into the fascinating world of the visual cortex, the part of your brain that makes sight possible. We're going to explore how scientists going all the way back to ancient Egypt gradually uncovered the secrets of this amazing system. Our guide for this journey is a chapter from Brain, Vision, Memory by neuroscientist Charles G. Gross.
What's so cool about this book is that it doesn't just give you the facts. It takes you on this historical adventure showing how our understanding of the visual cortex evolved over centuries. And trust me, it wasn't a straight line to the answers we have today.
Okay, let's unpack this. So we're talking ancient Egypt. Do we even have any records of them thinking about the brain?
You might be surprised to hear this, but we actually do.
Yeah.
We're going to start with the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus,
Yeah.
which is this incredible document from around 1700 BCE. Now get this, it's actually a copy of an even older text, and it contains what's believed to be the first written mention of the brain.
That's mind-blowing. So they were already thinking about the brain way back then. What kind of stuff did they write about?
Well, the papyrus mainly focuses on head injuries and their effects. What's remarkable is that they describe these injuries with a level of detail that's surprisingly empirical for the time. They even compare the appearance of the cortex to corrugations, which form in molten copper, which shows they were really observing the brain's structure.
So they were definitely paying attention to the brain even back then. Did they have any idea what it actually did?
That's where it gets interesting. Despite these observations, the ancient Egyptians, like many cultures at the time, believed that the heart, not the brain, was the seat of thought and sensation. So they were looking at the brain, but they hadn't quite connected it to the things we now know it controls.
Okay, so the brain is in the picture, but they haven't figured out its role yet. Makes you wonder, when did that shift happen? When did people start to realize that the brain, and specifically the visual cortex, is what allows us to see?
Well, that shift in thinking started with a Greek physician named Alcmaeon of Croton, who lived around 450 BCE. He challenged the heart-centric view and proposed, based on his anatomical studies, that the brain was actually responsible for sensation and thought. This earned him the title of the first neuroscientist.
He sounds like a true pioneer. Going against the established beliefs like that must have taken some guts.
It definitely did. But as with many scientific breakthroughs, not everyone immediately embraced this new idea. While some, like the philosopher Plato, supported Alcmaeon's view, others, like Aristotle, clung to the idea of the heart being the center of it all.
Hold on, Aristotle. The guy known for logic and scientific inquiry. He didn't believe the brain was calling the shots.
It's hard to believe now, isn't it? But remember, scientific understanding evolves over time. There's a theory that Aristotle's focus on animal dissections might have contributed to his misconception. It seems the connections between the sense organs and the heart might have appeared more prominent in the animals he studied.
So it was a case of drawing conclusions based on the available evidence, which back then was limited.
Precisely. And because Aristotle was such an influential figure, his view held sway for centuries. It really highlights how even the brightest minds can be influenced by the prevailing ideas of their time.
Okay, so we have Alcmaeon making this huge leap, identifying the brain as the control center. But then Aristotle's influence kind of muddies the waters. Where do we go from there? Did things get back on track with understanding the visual cortex?
Not quite. In the 3rd century BCE, a new theory took hold, the ventricular theory. This theory shifted the focus away from brain matter itself and placed cognitive functions within the fluid-filled cavities of the brain called ventricles.
So instead of looking at the brain tissue, they were focused on the fluid inside. Try to picture that. It seems like a pretty big jump.
It does seem strange now, knowing what we know. However, the ventricular theory was highly influential and remained the dominant view for over 1,000 years. Even brilliant minds like Leonardo da Vinci initially subscribed to this idea. You can actually see it reflected in some of his early anatomical drawings.
Wait, Leonardo da Vinci, the artist who painted the Mona Lisa, was into brains too.
Yes. Da Vinci was a true Renaissance man with boundless curiosity. Anatomy was one of his many passions, and his detailed drawings offer a glimpse into how anatomical knowledge was evolving at the time. It's incredible to see how his drawings became more accurate as he began dissecting brains himself, leading him to eventually question the ventricular theory.
So even da Vinci, with his incredible artistic talent and scientific mind, was initially influenced by the prevailing theory. But ultimately, his own observations led him to question it. It really shows how science is a process of constantly refining our understanding.
Absolutely. It's a journey with many twists and turns. And speaking of twists, our journey next takes us to a period where anatomists essentially dismissed the cortex as an unimportant covering, a so-called insensitive rind with no significant function.
Okay, so we go from focusing on the fluid in the brain to basically ignoring the outer layer altogether. What led them to that conclusion?
Well, remember, this was before we had the tools and techniques to really study brain activity in detail. They were relying mainly on anatomical observations and some pretty crude experiments.
So what kind of experiments led them to this insensitive rind idea?
A lot of it had to do with stimulation. Prominent scientists like Albrecht von Haller conducted experiments where they poked and prodded the cortex, and they found that it didn't seem to elicit any noticeable responses. This led them to believe that the cortex was insensitive and therefore not involved in any important functions.
Oh, because they couldn't immediately see a reaction, they assumed it wasn't doing anything?
Yeah.
It seems a bit hasty to jump to that conclusion.
It does now, but remember, science is all about building upon previous knowledge and testing assumptions. And to be fair, there were exceptions to this prevailing view. For instance, Emanuel Swedenborg, an 18th century scientist and philosopher, actually proposed that the cortex was responsible for both sensory and motor function.
So he was way ahead of his time, recognizing the cortex's importance. Did his ideas gain any traction back then?
Unfortunately, not Swedenborg's work, despite containing some genuinely insightful observations, was often dismissed because of his unconventional and mystical writings. His scientific contributions were often overshadowed by his spiritual and philosophical ideas, which were considered outside the mainstream of scientific thought.
It's a shame that his ideas are overlooked. So when did the cortex finally get its moment in the spotlight?
That moment came in the 19th century. This era saw a surge in ideas about organic evolution, particularly the concept of a progressive increase in the complexity of the nervous system over time. This newfound focus on evolution put the spotlight on the cortex, which was seen as the most recently evolved part of the brain.
So because the cortex was the newest addition, evolutionarily speaking, scientists started to think it must serve some pretty important specialized functions. It's like the cortex finally got the promotion it deserved.
You could say that thinkers like Herbert Spencer, who is heavily influenced by evolutionary ideas, championed the view that the cortex was the highest, most complex level of the nervous system. This sparked a renewed interest in understanding its functions. Of course, this also led to some rather interesting and ultimately incorrect theories like phrenology.
Phrenology, yes.
Yeah.
Isn't that the one where they examine the bumps on your skull to determine your personality traits?
Yeah.
I've always been curious about that. It seems a bit out there.
It does, doesn't it? Franz Gall, the mind behind phrenology, believed that different areas of the brain were responsible for different mental faculties, and that the size of these areas reflected in the bumps on your skull could reveal your character.
Okay, so the idea of localized function in the brain wasn't entirely wrong, but I can't imagine feeling someone's head would give you much insight into their personality. How did the theory even become so popular?
Well, remember, this was a time when people were eager to understand the brain, and phrenology offered a seemingly simple and straightforward way to do that. Plus, in the absence of more sophisticated tools and methods, it seemed somewhat plausible, at least to some. Unfortunately, it turned out to be pseudoscience, but like many wrong turns in science, it contributed in a roundabout way to our understanding.
So even though phrenology wasn't accurate, it did help solidify the idea that different parts of the brain has specialized functions.
Exactly. And around the same time, clinical observations of patients with brain injuries were providing more concrete evidence for this concept. A neurologist named John Hewlings Jackson, who studied epilepsy, began to notice that the seizures his patients experienced seemed to originate in specific parts of the brain and would affect particular muscle groups.
So by observing these seizures, he was able to trace their origin in the brain and start mapping out the body within the motor cortex. That's incredible.
Yes, it was a major breakthrough. Jackson's work further supported the idea of localization of function in the brain, and it laid the groundwork for more detailed mapping of the cortex.
It's amazing how sometimes even studying something as unfortunate as a seizure can lead to significant advancements in our knowledge. So with all these pieces coming together, the focus on evolution, phrenology, and clinical observations, how did they finally zero in on the visual cortex, the area responsible for sight?
It was a process of elimination, really. A lot of it involved lesion studies in animals. Researchers would damage specific parts of the brain and then observe what functions were impaired. It's a bit like playing a high-stakes game of Where's Waldo with the brain.
I can only imagine the debates and disagreements that must have happened. Were there any particular researchers who played a key role in this visual cortex quest?
Oh, absolutely. Researchers like David Ferrier, Herman Munch, and Edward Albert Schaefer were key figures in this search.
Well,
Ferrier initially believed the visual area was located in a part of the parietal lobe. But Munch and Schaefer, through their own meticulous experiments, challenged his view and argued that the visual area resided in the occipital lobe.
so a real scientific showdown. Different labs vying to solve the puzzle. Did they eventually reach a consensus on the location?
They did. And it wasn't just lesion studies that helped clinch it. A new technique emerged: electrical stimulation of the brain.
Wow, so they were actually zapping the brain with electricity. That sounds intense.
It was a revolutionary technique. Earlier, two researchers, Edward Hitzig and Gustav Fritsch, had discovered that stimulating different parts of the brain could elicit movements in specific body parts. This technique was later refined and applied to mapping sensory areas, including the visual cortex.
So by stimulating the occipital lobe and observing the responses, they finally confirmed its role in vision. Mystery solved.
Well, sort of locating the visual area was a huge step, but it opened up a whole new set of questions. It was like finding the right neighborhood, but then realizing you had to map out all the individual houses and streets within it.
Okay, so we found the general area, but what about the organization within it? How is the visual cortex structured?
That's where it gets really fascinating. Remember John Hewlings Jackson's work on epilepsy and his observations about the map of the body within the motor cortex? Well, it turns out that same principle applies to the visual cortex. There's a point-to-point representation of the visual field mapped onto the occipital lobe.
Wait, so each point in our visual field has a corresponding point in our brain. That means that if a specific part of my visual cortex is stimulated, I'd actually perceive a visual sensation, even if there's no light hitting my eyes.
Exactly. The brain creates its own internal representation of the visual world. To uncover this intricate organization, scientists needed new tools. Remember those evoked potentials we talked about? Those electrical signals from the brain? Well, they were instrumental in mapping out the visual cortex.
So by tracking the brain's electrical responses to visual stimuli, they could pinpoint where in the visual cortex those signals were coming from. It's like tracing the wires of vision.
Precisely. And those techniques were further refined by two scientists, David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel. They made groundbreaking discoveries about the organization of the visual cortex. Their work revealed incredibly specialized structures called orientation columns and ocular dominance columns.
Orientation columns and ocular dominance columns. Okay, those sound pretty technical. Can you break those down for us?
Imagine a grid, like a checkerboard but with much smaller squares. Each square in this grid represents a tiny area in your visual cortex. Now picture lines of different orientations, vertical, horizontal, diagonal, running through these squares. The orientation columns are like pathways in this grid. Each column contains neurons that respond best to lines of a particular orientation.
So it's like a filter system where each part of the brain is tuned to specific lines and edges in the visual world.
Exactly. It's an incredibly efficient way to process all the visual information coming in from the eyes. Now imagine another layer to this grid. These are the ocular dominance columns, and they represent which eye each neuron prefers.
So some neurons are right eye fans and others are left eye fans.
Precisely. Hubel and Wiesel's work revealed this remarkable level of detail within the visual cortex, and they did it by using microelectrode recordings, which allowed them to listen in on the activity of individual neurons in the visual cortex.
That's incredible. By listening to the chatter of individual brain cells, they were able to unravel the hidden structure of vision. But we're still only talking about the primary visual cortex, right? V1. What about the rest of the visual system? What lies beyond V1?
It turns out there's a whole network of visual areas in the brain, each with its own specialized role.
More to explore. Perfect. So what's
Yeah.
waiting for us beyond V1? What other visual areas did scientists uncover?
Well, get this, some of these discoveries were actually made back in the 19th century, but were largely overlooked until much later. It's a reminder that even in science, timing is everything.
Lost and found observations in brain science. That's fascinating. Tell me more about these overlooked discoveries. What did they miss?
Back in 1888, two researchers, Brown and Schaefer, were studying the effects of temporal lobe damage in monkeys. What they observed hinted at the temporal lobe's role in visual perception, but their findings weren't fully appreciated at the time.
Okay, hold on. We've been talking about the occipital lobe as the visual center. Now we're bringing the temporal lobe into the mix. I'm intrigued. What exactly did Brown and Schaefer observe?
They noticed some peculiar behavioral changes in the monkeys after removing parts of their temporal lobes. For example, one monkey who was quite aggressive before the surgery became surprisingly docile and tame afterwards.
That's a pretty dramatic change. Did they figure out what caused this shift in behavior?
Well, they also observed that this monkey seemed to have trouble recognizing familiar objects. Even though its vision seemed otherwise intact, it was as if the monkey could see but couldn't make sense of what it was seeing.
So it's not just about detecting light and shapes. There's a whole other level of processing involved in understanding what we're seeing. It's like seeing the words in a book but not being able to read or comprehend them.
Exactly. But at the time, Brown and Schaefer were primarily focused on proving that the occipital lobe was the main visual area. Their observations about the temporal lobe's role in visual perception were intriguing, but didn't really fit into the prevailing understanding, so they weren't explored further.
It makes you wonder how many other important observations might have been overlooked throughout history simply because they didn't fit the current paradigm.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it? But thankfully, these early observations about the temporal lobe weren't forgotten forever. They were rediscovered and expanded upon decades later by Heinrich Klüver and Paul Beesey.
Okay, so Kluver and Busey picked up where Brown and Schaefer left off. What did they find?
Klüver and Beesey conducted a series of experiments in the 1930s, also involving the temporal lobes of monkeys. They observed a syndrome they called psychic blindness in monkeys with temporal lobe lesions.
Psychic blindness. That sounds pretty intense. What were the symptoms?
These monkeys, much like those studied by Brown and Schaefer, could see but struggled to recognize familiar objects. They would approach objects as if they were seeing them for the first time, even if they had interacted with those objects countless times before.
So they were seeing without truly recognizing, like looking at a familiar face but not knowing who it belonged to.
That's a good analogy. This work by Klüver and Busey was pivotal because it finally established the importance of the temporal lobe in visual processing. It showed that even though the occipital lobe receives the initial visual input, the temporal lobe plays a critical role in understanding what we see, attaching meaning to visual information.
It's like a relay race. The occipital lobe catches the ball and passes it to the temporal lobe for further analysis and interpretation.
That's a great way to visualize it. And the discoveries didn't stop there. As scientists developed more sophisticated tools and techniques, they began to map out even more visual areas beyond V1. They found areas called V2, V3, and many more, each with its own specialized function.
Hold on, V2, V3. How many of these visual areas are there? It sounds like we're going deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole.
You're not wrong. Researchers have now identified over 24 distinct visual areas in the brain, each contributing to our overall visual experience. It's a testament to just how complex and sophisticated the visual system really is.
24? That's mind-boggling. I'm starting to realize that vision is so much more than just seeing. It's a whole symphony of brain activity.
Precisely. And to add another layer of complexity, these visual areas are organized into two main pathways, the dorsal pathway and the ventral pathway.
Two pathways. Okay, I'm ready for another lesson in brain anatomy. What are the roles of these dorsal and ventral pathways?
Think of them as two parallel streams of visual processing. The dorsal pathway, which runs from V1 up towards the parietal lobe, is often referred to as the where pathway.
The where pathway, so it tells us where things are in space.
Exactly. It helps us process spatial information like the location of objects, how they're moving, and how to interact with them. It's like the GPS of your visual system.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the ventral pathway?
The ventral pathway runs from V1 down to the temporal lobe and is called the what pathway.
So the what pathway helps us figure out what we're looking at.
Precisely. It's responsible for object recognition, recognizing faces, places, objects, basically attaching meaning to the visual information coming from the eyes.
It's incredible how these two pathways work together. The dorsal pathway helps us navigate the world, and the ventral pathway helps us understand what we're seeing.
It's a beautiful example of the brain's remarkable ability to process information in parallel and integrate it into a seamless experience.
We've come a long way in this deep dive. From those first mentions of the brain in ancient Egypt to mapping out these intricate visual pathways, it's been an incredible journey.
And it's a journey that's still ongoing. Even with all that we've learned, there's so much more to discover about the visual cortex and how it creates our visual experience. Think of all those misinterpretations, those overlooked observations, those forgotten discoveries along the way.
It makes you wonder what other secrets the brain might be holding, just waiting to be uncovered. And it makes you appreciate just how amazing this organ truly is.
Absolutely. The brain, with its intricate networks and its capacity for both complexity and adaptation, is a true marvel of evolution.
So much to ponder. As always, the journey of discovery continues. We encourage you to explore any questions this deep dive has sparked, and maybe even delve deeper into the mysteries of the brain. You never know, you might be the one to make the next big breakthrough. Until next time.